Shana Tova. There's a teaching from the Hasidic master, the Baal Shem Tov, on a verse from the flood story when God tells Noah, make a window in the ark, sohar ta'aseh la teva. The word for ark, teva, though, can also mean word. Thus his drash, make a window in the word. Words of Torah and prayer, the Baal Shem urges, should radiate light. I've been contemplating this teaching, though, as speaking to words in general. When words become monochrome, flatten into particular meanings rather than refract their multivalent realities, they become less generative, more utilitarian, even weaponized. Words and phrases, they mean different things in different contexts when spoken and heard by different people, but our use of them often is aimed at solidifying them and making them opaque, impenetrable. At the Passover Seder, a night-long ritual dedicated to telling a story, the Haggadah praises each person who expands the telling of the Exodus. It's generally understood to celebrate diving into the details, going late into the night, analyzing the text, but I can hear it also praising the expansion of how we tell the story, finding new ways of naming the path from enslavement to freedom, using new words, finding new phrases, keeping ourselves from slipping into the well-worn ruts that inhibit liberation right here in this moment. Narratives, they shape how we see people, ourselves and others, in ways that predate us by generations even. We live in realities as individuals and communities constructed through language that someone first spoke or, more consequentially, wrote into being. Ta-Nehisi Coates' new book, The Message, is about just this. It's received a lot of press, as I'm sure many of you have seen, for its content about Israel-Palestine, which is one of the sections of the book. But the through line in the book is the question of the stories we've inherited and the stories that we tell. At one point, he imagines what his late father might have observed as he assessed the systematic inequities that pervaded his life. What my father would have seen is that he was confronted not just by the yawning chasm between wealth and want, but by the stories that sought to inscribe that chasm as natural. He would have pointed to the arsenal of histories, essays, novels, ethnographies, teleplays, treatments, and monographs, which were not white supremacy itself, but its syllabus, its corpus, its canon. Baruch she'amar v'haya ha'olam. Blessed is the one who spoke, and the world came into being. Traditionally, we say this prayer every morning. It's a reference to Genesis, of course, in which the world is created through words. And God said, let there be light, and there was light, and on like that. I've offered the intention countless times that this prayer reminds us that with words we create worlds, and with words we can destroy them as well. But I realize maybe it's more true to say simply that we create worlds through our words. Sometimes those worlds are redemptive, loving, and caring. Other times they are cruel, callous, and false. As Coates hauntingly instructs us, in order for violence to be done, there is virtually always a narrative that justifies it. Stories about people, their origins, their histories, their innate nobility or brutality that give credence to what is done either to us or for us. The language, the stories, shape how we are seen by others and ourselves. And so on some level, they shape who we are. As Coates implores his writing students to whom the book is addressed, we are charged with examining the stories we have been told and how they undergird the politics we have accepted, and then telling new stories ourselves. I hear these words and read Coates' book, and even though I haven't reached that section yet, just beginning to make my way through it, I'm reflecting on the stories that we tell in regard to Israelis and Palestinians. And I want to reflect on that. A realm in which we so desperately need to tell new stories. And before I say more, I want to name that I felt some trepidation as I thought about this talk and about the holidays in general. Because this is such a sensitive and fraught time. And not for all of us in the same way. My intention here is to name some things that feel true to me as part of the ongoing learning that we do in our community, to discover new stories and reclaim old ones that help in our own small ways to create new realities. Realities, as I was offering on Rosh Hashanah, in which we as Jews find safety and comfort in solidarity with others. And realities in which both Israelis and Palestinians are safe and free, which I believe is a reality we all want to see manifest. Over this past year, of course, there have been in our public sphere a quantity of stories about the lives, the experience, and the nature of Israelis and Palestinians, the extent to which we could have never fathomed a year ago. And I'm often left heartbroken and unmoored by some of the stories I witness being told about one of them or the other. I'm also struck again and again by the imbalance between which people gets to tell their stories where and how. On the right in this country, I assume we would all recognize that imbalance. The state of Israel is sacrosanct, and Palestinians are other. On the left, especially in a city like Portland, it may feel these days like the Palestinian story is being told more loudly and clearly than the Israeli one. I imagine some of you feel that way. And I get that. This past year has afforded Palestinians an opportunity to tell their stories on a global stage, especially in progressive circles, in ways they have never been able to even approach. In the streets, on college campuses, and in our public schools, there's an unprecedented level of awareness about the Palestinian experience, and with it, unprecedented advocacy and agitation. And I know it has felt jarring and uncomfortable for many among us. One thing I want to highlight, though, is that within halls of power, in the United States in particular, on both the right and the left, Israel is still centered, and Palestinian voices continue to be ignored, silenced, and diminished. We can see this in regards to which student groups have gotten suspended and how law enforcement is harnessed, for instance. And we saw it on perhaps the biggest stage among liberal America at the Democratic National Convention, when the request for a Palestinian speaker was denied. The parents of Hirsch Goldberg Poland, who at the time was still being held captive by Hamas, though tragically was later murdered, spoke movingly. I'm sure many of you saw it as well. Their appearance and their heartfelt plea was a gut-wrenching and powerful testimony. As impossible as I can only imagine it was for them as parents, I felt heartened that they were given that opportunity to tell their story. Leaders requesting a Palestinian speaker, though, even though they agreed to have the speaker and their words vetted by the DNC, were denied that opportunity. Vice President Harris did lift up the struggle of both peoples in her speech, and I want to reflect on her words, which I assume most of us watched and I imagine appreciated. She certainly offered a more inclusive message than we have often seen from U.S. leadership at that level. In listening, though, I heard some familiar techniques that I've become accustomed to noticing when watching how the war and the conflict in general is reported on in the mainstream public. This is what she said. And let me be clear, I will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself, and I will always ensure Israel has the ability to defend itself. Because the people of Israel must never again face the horror that a terrorist organization called Hamas caused on October 7th, including unspeakable sexual violence and the massacre of young people at a music festival. This is a powerful statement. She names specific atrocities committed, the perpetrators who committed them, and underscores Israel's agency in being able to respond. It's the recognition that every people deserves. She continued, At the same time, what has happened in Gaza over the past 10 months is devastating. So many innocent lives lost, desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety over and over again. The scale of suffering is heartbreaking. This is a compassionate statement. But not only is there no perpetrator mentioned in this case, there's not even an offense. No action of any group against the people of Gaza. Notice the passive voice. What has happened in Gaza? If those sentences were taken out of context and we didn't know, we could almost be mistaken to think that Gaza had endured a series of natural disasters. The only indication of human-caused harm, and it's subtle, is the word innocent. So many innocent lives lost, implying that someone did something to those people that they didn't deserve. Either way, they have no agency, no right or recognized capability to defend themselves. They are certainly worthy of our compassion, but they are simply that, suffering and desperate. All they can do is flee, and all we can do is feel sorry for them. This is not about Vice President Harris, who I believe genuinely feels compassion for the Palestinian people. This is about the stories that we tell. There is a whole corpus of narratives dating back over 100 years, and in ways much longer than that, that are foundations of this one. At the heart of those, perhaps, is the phrase, a land without a people for a people without a land. I grew up learning that, as I'm sure many of you did as well. It was a beacon for many European Jews, some of our ancestors fleeing for their lives, but it was patently false. And it rendered the people already living there invisible. The consequences of those narratives were severe. They shape how the lives and the deaths of each people are viewed to this day. We internalize them without even realizing it. To use Coates' words, they undergird the politics we have accepted. And they help justify what we have witnessed over this past year. In response to the brutal massacre of October 7th, a brutal massacre many times over in return that has to date killed over 40,000 people, rendered hundreds of thousands starving and suffering under inadequate medical care, and decimated an entire society. I know in my heart that we do not want this reality. We Jews, we human beings, certainly we at Havurah. But it's felt, honestly, very confusing to me, painfully so, over this past year to witness the story that so much of the Jewish world is telling. A story in which this mass killing is unfortunate, but necessary. I've struggled to locate other stories that might help us find a way through. What are the stories we need to tell? Or maybe that's not the right question. Maybe first we need to shine light on and through the stories we're currently telling. I find myself reflecting more and more on this image of the window in the Word, in this moment of words used so forcefully and narrowly. And I wonder, is there some way we can do this differently? And I'm thinking very much about our community right now. And I love how many faces I'm not familiar with and people I know who come maybe every high holidays, Havurah, maybe this is your first time here, and it's so welcome, and it's wonderful to have you. And in this moment, I want to say in particular, really just speaking to the Havurah community and all that we've been through over this year of trying to speak and listen and hear each other. And I'm thinking very much about our community right now, about how we within Havurah might be able to expand and enrich the language we have to name what is happening and to understand it. In May, the writer Zadie Smith had an article in The New Yorker entitled Shibboleth. A shibboleth is a word or a phrase that distinguishes one group from another. In addressing the discourse mainly on campuses concerning Israel-Palestine, Smith writes, "In these constructed narratives, there are always a series of shibboleths, that is, phrases that can't be said, or conversely, phrases that must be said. Once these words or phrases have been spoken, river to the sea, existential threat, right to defend, one state, two states, Zionist, colonialist, imperialist, terrorist, and one's positionality established, then and only then will the ethics of the question be attended to or absolutely ignored. This is the word used as shield or weapon even. It's the supplanting of engaged discourse with ideological orthodoxy. The subscription to a prevalent tendency in our society which mistakes certainty for wisdom and demonization for moral clarity. The origin of the term shibboleth is fascinating. It's from the book of Judges in the Bible when there was a civil war between the Israelite tribes of the Gileadites and the Ephraimites. Gilead was amassed at the Jordan, and when someone would come to cross, the soldiers would ask, "Are you an Ephraimite?" If the person said no, they would tell them to say the word shibolet. The Ephraimites, who pronounced the word sibolet, would be discovered and killed as soon as they spoke it. It was a method to expose one's status as a friend or enemy, specifically among one's own people. A tool of division. A shibboleth, then, represents our use of language to prove that someone is fundamentally wrong, not worthy of our concern or curiosity. One alternative, perhaps antidote to this, is taking time to truly inhabit words, not to turn away from them, but to grapple with them. Even those most fraught words and phrases, like the ones that Zadie Smith mentioned. They all either mean a lot more than they're often understood to, or they demand much more articulation and consideration than they generally get. We need to make windows for those words, too, to engage as fully as we can with their multi-layered meanings. And this is a hope I have for us at Havurah in the year to come, that we find more ways to dwell within or among these words, these narratives, and to meet each other as we do so. One of the reasons this is so important for us as Jews is that some of the ways these phrases get condensed and confined paint our people in a false light. When we are willing to engage with the terms directly and shine light through them, we come to understand and tell a truer story. A story that may still not be easy for some of us, but one in which we can parse out the system from the people living within the system, and one we can learn from and envision our way out of. In response to the fraught term colonialism, for instance, we often turn away, we shut it down out of hand. It's not hard to find that concept in Zionist literature, though, or to see how it's transpired in practice. And once we acknowledge it, we can examine it and articulate how it is not the full story. We can name the primary roles of much larger colonial powers like the British Empire and the United States, rather than falsely characterizing Israel's role and uniqueness in the world. We can acknowledge the fullness of our people's history, the violence we've endured, the catastrophes we've faced, the many exiles that have led us to where we are today. And we can acknowledge the ways in which our history over the past century in Israel-Palestine has in turn caused a whole series of catastrophes for the Palestinian people. I keep returning to something I shared on Rosh Hashanah from John A. Powell of the Othering and Belonging Institute. He says, "We can be hard and critical on structures, but soft on people." Hard and critical on structures, but soft on people. What I'm trying to name is about structures, how systems maintained through violence harm people. But we need to have the clarity and the humility, frankly, to differentiate structures from the people who live within them. Across the political spectrum, we slip into dehumanization of one people or another. And while that has different consequences for different people, it is never a true or helpful story. Soft on people means that we can be clear-eyed and honest in criticizing systems while simultaneously upholding the humanity of each and every single person without exception. So here's a story we tell. It's a very short one that many of you know. Anyone who takes one life is as if they've destroyed an entire world. And anyone who saves one life is as if they've sustained an entire world. Perhaps all other stories are in service of this one. How do we reconcile the loss of all these worlds since last Yom Kippur? The narratives we tell are still too confined, too encumbered by harmful stories that predate them. When our language is limited, so is our imagination, which is a faculty we urgently need right now. So let's make windows in our words, shine light through the stories we've inherited, and begin telling new realities into being in the year to come. Gamar Chatima Tova.